All right, guys, we have a thread here from Alec Sanis. Want to once again encourage everybody to follow his work. He's absolutely fantastic at Equality Alec on Twitter, constantly shredding apart the media for the way that they cover crime and issues pertaining to police. He does fantastic work. Thread: sometimes the bias of the New York Times is so outrageous that it surprises even me, because what the New York Times did yesterday in its election coverage is so dangerous, I try my best to analyze it carefully below. On June 8th, the day after the June 7th elections, the New York Times published a story telling its readers about what it called the shifting winds on criminal justice. The New York Times' lengthy article and analysis is based entirely on two individual local races, the recall of the progressive DA in San Francisco and the primary for the mayor of Los Angeles, according to the New York Times. There is a lot of remarkable stuff about this story, but one thing stands out above all the rest. There were huge progressive criminal justice wins in California on election night, and the New York Times just ignores them. I honestly would not believe what I was reading. Sorry about that. Excuse me, guys. Take a look at this thread to see that the progressive criminal justice wins New York Times erased. Incredibly, a paradigm tough on crime candidate ran a scorched earth campaign against progressive California AG and got trounced in a statewide election. New York Times ignored it. I want to just take a quick moment here to point out, you guys, this is one of the most pervasive forms of propaganda that the mainstream press likes to use. It's propaganda by omission. I'm sure a lot of you understand this, but I always feel like I should dive into that for just a second. Picking and choosing which things to focus on and which things to ignore is one of the easiest ways to do propaganda while still saying, we're not lying though, right? We're just telling half of the story. So they're going to ignore a lot of races where, like Kenneth Mejia, for example, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. They're going to ignore races where candidates who were hard on police and want to defund police and want to rein in police and want to put resources into other programs like housing and education and mental health care and rehabilitation, et cetera, et cetera. Those kinds of candidates did well in a lot of races. The New York Times simply chooses to ignore them. So what does that do to the reader? To the reader, they're presented with this set of facts as though that set of facts is representative of the whole. So the New York Times is not going to acknowledge these are a few anecdotal examples that actually go against a general trend. They're just going to portray it as though it represents the general trend. And then the average viewer thinks, oh, so across the country, people are supporting pro-police candidates. So it's a very nefarious, very pervasive form of propaganda to simply omit the facts that are inconvenient to your narrative. And the New York Times constantly engaging in that. And Alec, again, constantly calling it out. Go follow him, you guys. At Equality Alec. Go follow him. Carrying on. But there is so much more. Right near San Francisco, in a county of over 1 million people, another progressive DA targeted by police unions and tough-on-crime Democrats won easily. The New York Times ignores it. It gets worse. Even Oakland's election results directly contradict the New York Times, as a local journalist pointed out when comprehensively criticizing the New York Times article. He's constantly linking to further threads and reference points here too, you guys. So again, go check this thread out yourself and go into some of the details if you would like. In fact, all over California and the country, continuing a multi-year trend, many progressive Democrats did very well and a few didn't in elections about criminal justice issues. It's astonishing that the New York Times doesn't mention any of them. So what does the New York Times choose to cover? The recall of San Francisco DA, where GOP billionaire flooded the race and created a giant mismatch. And 2, the LA mayoral race, in which a former GOP billionaire spent $41 million on the primary. He outspent opponents by a 10-to-1 ratio. He still only received 40% of the vote. So that context is rather important, is it not? One candidate had a distinct advantage and did significantly worse than that advantage would have suggested. But how does the New York Times frame it, you guys? You know how they're going to frame it, right? But there was a fraud that isn't as noticeable. The New York Times omitted that reform policies of San Francisco DA were popular. Each of his major issues, not prosecuting kids, cash bail, wrongful convictions, worker protection, going after corrupt cops, and more, polled with big support. And he has some reference there from public policy polling. When writing a story about unpopularity of the progressive platform, did the New York Times reporter not know that the DA's major reform policies were widely popular, or did the New York Times reporter know it and choose to omit it? Doesn't popularity of policies bear on what Democrats should advocate? Instead, using only these 2 local election night results and ignoring all of the contrary evidence, The New York Times concocted a national story published at 5 a.m. the next morning about a reckoning for progressives and shifting winds on criminal justice. It's almost as if the article was already written before the election, no matter what the results. Here is the New York Times' remarkable thesis. The elections on Tuesday showed the extent to which the political winds have shifted, even in Democratic cities. According to Meltwater, this article had a potential reach of 170 million people across platforms after it was given prominent front page placement right after the election. The message to them: Democrats have to move right on crime. The other New York Times election night piece was even worse. It was filled with racist, outlandish misinformation that I've debunked time and again. For example, property crime is down in San Francisco, but the New York Times says property crime is unchecked. Same message. Voters want Dems to move right on crime. I don't know what to say about a journalist and a group of editors who concoct this sweeping message by ignoring most of the evidence and most of the very elections they purport to be covering. How could this happen? As always, when you see articles like this, ask yourself, why is this particular angle news? How did it get to reporter, and who pitched it? What is the goal of the article? How did they choose which voice to quote and which to ignore? Who benefits from framing issues this way? Let's take a look at the sources chosen by the reporter and editors in chronological order. This is another exercise that Alec likes to do that I highly recommend that you do, you guys. If you're reading an article, just simply look at the sources that they're using, and you will often see a pattern. You will often see whose side of the story you're actually being presented with and which side is being completely ignored. The New York Times constantly will present only pro-police people as quote-unquote experts, which again, it's that omission thing, right? That presents to the viewer as though there is this expert consensus, when in reality, they're ignoring a large portion of what experts actually think. In some cases, actually portraying a minority opinion among experts as though it's a strong majority opinion among experts. It should be considered journalistic malpractice. The New York Times ought to be ashamed of this practice, right? Anyway, here are the sources that they listed. Centrist political consultant known for criticizing progressives, strategists and leaders in both parties. Talk about vague. That could mean almost anything, but it sounds like it's an expert. It sounds like it's someone worth listening to. Centrist former politician, same person quoted making joke about the DA in last week's New York Times debacle. Same guy again making a joke pretending he doesn't know AOC's name. Pollster for Rick Caruso, a billionaire former Republican running for LA mayor. Same guy again. Real estate developer, advisor to former Republican mayor and LA police commissioner. Same Caruso pollster for a third time. Eric Adams, chief of staff. Jesus fucking Christ. Strategist in both parties. Quote, head of Super PAC for House Republicans twice, centrist mayor in San Francisco, recalled San Francisco DA, Jesse Jackson, anonymous Democratic strategist, Sean Patrick Maloney, LOL. These sources have political and business interests in promoting centrist pro-police narratives. The article almost surgically excludes any other perspective, including the perspective of many progressive strategists and candidates who have won on exactly the opposite message. Excludes those who believe, based on evidence, that attacking the root causes of inequality and violence is giving people better housing, care, working conditions, and schools is a more popular political strategy than fear-mongering and pandering to police and developers. Instead of quoting or listening to other voices, the New York Times mocks them. Without describing their nuanced, science-based views to readers, the New York Times calls anyone with different views the activist left and the activist class. It even gives space for the second time in a week to an 88-year-old retired male politician to make a needless joke about a progressive leader, this time about AOS or AOC or whatever that woman's name is. As you read this, I want you to ask, is this a reasonable attempt to give people actual information about what progressives believe, to educate people about different strategies from experts who disagree? Is it a reasonable effort to educate the public about an issue? Because it doesn't talk to anyone with different views, let alone explain them. The New York Times misleads the public with straw person arguments. Some voters demand action on racial and systemic disparities, while others are focused on their own sense of safety in their homes and neighborhoods. You guys see how that's framed? It's utterly ridiculous. According to the New York Times, it's an either-or situation. The voters who care about systemic injustices aren't focused on the safety of their neighborhood. It's hard to fathom a professional political journalist displaying less understanding of progressive principles, or perhaps more committed to misleading people about what real people on the left believe. Does anyone believe that millions of poor people, black people, young people, teachers, nurses, public health experts, faith leaders, crime survivors, etc., who are fighting against systemic injustices and inequality don't care about safety in their homes and neighborhoods? That's another point I really just want to take a second on, you guys. This notion, think about the implication with what the New York Times is saying. They're basically saying progressive activists and those who actually want to reform prosecutor offices and reform our justice system in progressive ways, they're implying that we don't care about safety. Do you honestly, think about that for a second? Do you honestly believe that? Do you think progressives are cool with violent crime? Do you think progressives want their neighborhoods, their communities, their neighbors, their family members, their friends, their colleagues? You think they want these people to be unsafe? You think they want to live in a dangerous community? What an absurd implication. But that's what the New York Times is relying on when they frame this entire issue the way that they frame it, right? But it's utterly absurd. Anyone who takes 3 seconds to think about it will realize immediately that, of course, what the New York Times is saying is absurd on the surface. Carrying on. In fact, most researchers are finding that it is exactly the neighborhoods with the most gun violence who most support progressive prosecutors. Corporate media and centrist strategists did not have an article ready by 5 a.m. election morning about Philly DA's re-election victory on a progressive platform against tough-on-crime challengers. When that election disrupted centrist narrative, it was swept under the rug. 15 paragraphs into the New York Times story, we are offered the disclaimer that turnout was low and that there is always a risk of over-interpreting local races. After that brief interlude, reporters get right back to the main message. Democrats need to get tough on crime. 23 paragraphs into the piece, the New York Times treats readers to this gem. The extent to which crime is actually up depends on the category being measured and the particular jurisdiction. But strategists in both parties said that whatever the data shows, there is a widespread sense that daily life in big city America is no longer as safe as it once was. You guys, that's utterly meaningless. You might as well just say people say, or some people are saying. There's nothing to back that up. The statistics say quite the opposite. There's nothing to back that up. Nothing. This is a striking paragraph. It contradicts the misleading claim at the beginning of the piece that rising crime is the thing actually motivating centrist Democrats, a claim later quietly deleted by New York Times editors with no correction, as I explained in my newsletter. Crime is a terrible measure of social harm, but crime as measured by police is actually near historic lows in the U.S., and many crimes that cops report aren't even rising at all, as the New York Times now admits in paragraph 23. But this isn't an article about evidence. This is an article about what strategists say that people sense. I want to try to be as clear as I can about what's really going on here. In coming months, you will hear a lot from news media about how fear of rising crime means Dems need to boost police and prisons to be successful politically. A lot of strategists will be quoted. Elite corporate media will justify this as simply reporting how people feel. Setting aside that people feel this way, in large part because of relentless, misleading coverage of crime, there is a larger and more insidious problem. The media reports the centrist corporate pivot to more police and punishment as a natural, reasonable response to Democrats. I do want to take a moment here, though, on the first point. So the New York Times first pounds into people's heads that people feel like we need to be tougher on crime. People feel like cities are less safe. They pound this into their viewers' heads over the entire course of the existence of the paper. And then they turn around and report that people feel the way that the New York Times has told them to feel. You see how this is a self-fulfilling prophecy? It is ridiculous. It's the whole, does the dog wag the tail or vice versa? The media tells you how to feel and then reports on how you feel and uses that to justify their misleading framing of the entire issue. Utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. Carrying on. Responding to fear rising crime with pivot to more punishment is like saying fear of climate change means that Democrat strategists are saying that people must donate to Exxon. One of the most important functions of Copaganda is to treat more punishment as a reasonable solution to social problems. Strategists say we have to do it, even though the available scientific evidence says it won't solve the problem because it has nothing to do with root causes. The actual evidence is clear. Real safety is the product not of the machinery of state violence, but comes from reducing inequality, giving people places to live, ensuring that people have access to care, and in investing in the ability of our children to play and to be educated. One of the greatest frauds but most essential roles of modern news is selling people the wrong solutions to the wrong problems in order to prevent the reduction of inequality. If you like this thread and my threads generally, you can read them in a much cleaner format with links by signing up to my newsletter. I encourage everybody to go do that. And he has the link there at the end of a lot of his threads. You can also find it on his Twitter page. And then he always rewards us with a picture of his cat or an animal or something of the sort at the end of his threads. At Equality Alec, go give him a follow, and do not listen to the New York Times and other outlets when they frame issues on crime and police in such misleading ways. Look out for these various forms of Copaganda. And I think one of the best tricks you can do, you guys, when you're reading an article is simply list out sources and read them back to yourself. You'll get a pretty clear picture of what message is being pushed and how that message is being framed.